Welcome back to the reproduction lecture. So we left off talking about marsupials and how the infants are really undeveloped when they're born. So the heart, four-chambered heart that we see in mammals, the septum or the tissue that divides the two ventricles is not complete. The lungs don't have their fully formed structure with the little bubbles, the alveoli, where gas exchange occurs. And then the infants are completely hairless, and their sensory systems are not developed yet. So they're blind because their eyes haven't fully developed. Their eyelids are not formed yet, so they just have skin covering the developing eye tissue. Their ears are not functional yet, and so on. But they do have one body part that is particularly well developed, more well developed than the rest of their bodies, and that's their front limbs. And this has to do with the birth process for infant marsupials. When they are born, they are responsible for getting themselves from the birth canal to the nipple into the pouch if the female has a pouch. So they do that all by themselves without the assistance of their mothers, and they do that by climbing across the fur using their well-developed front limbs. So they use their front feet for grabbing a hold of the fur and pulling themselves to the nipple. And so we'll take a quick look at that. And here we have an infant marsupial. Here's the head. You can see the eyes are covered up, the ears aren't fully formed, and it really looks like a fetus from a placental mammal. It's attached to the nipple here, so there are 4 nipples within this female's abdomen, and so it forms a semi-permanent attachment around that nipple and just stays there for several weeks. If you look at the rest of its body, here are the front limbs, and you can see all the structures. You can see the 5 toes, but there's no hair. You can see right through the skin. Front limbs are functional. They have musculature. The hind limbs are just little buds, so they don't have all the pieces that they'll have as an adult, and the tail end is also not fully formed. Oops, sorry about that. I can't see my arrow. Alrighty, so I showed in the last picture how the nipple swells in the mouth of the infant marsupial to make a semi-permanent attachment. Here's another picture. This one's in black and white, but you can see the head of the marsupial here. Here's the nipple, and it's quite large relative to the size of the head of the little marsupial. You can again see the very muscular and functional front limbs. So semi-permanent attachment means that the infant doesn't become voluntarily detached. If it were to become detached, if somebody were to pull it off, it could not reattach again and it would die. So after it forms this attachment with the nipple, it'll stay in the pouch for varying lengths of time depending on the species, but up to a year it'll spend some time in the pouch, going in and out of the pouch, like you see in this fairly well-grown infant kangaroo. And when it leaves the pouch, it's roughly a size that's similar to a similarly sized placental mammal. So they're sort of completing the development in the pouch that a placental mammal would have completed inside the uterus. Then our third group of mammals are the eutherian mammals or the placental mammals. They give birth to young that are relatively well developed compared to the monotremes and the marsupials. The young, after they're born, aren't normally carried around attached to the nipples like marsupial infants are. The placenta is more complex than we see in the marsupials, and they have variability in the level of development of the offspring. So they have the capacity to give birth to altricial or precocial offspring. Altricial offspring are those that are fairly undeveloped at the time of birth. We'll look at a quick video. So you can see there's no hair. The eyes are still covered over with skin, the ear flaps are not developed, and it's not capable of locomotion. It's just sitting there sort of twitching. But you can see that the body structures are more well developed than in the marsupial. Going backwards. On the other hand, they have the capacity to have much more well-developed offspring. So we're going to take a look at some guinea pigs. Guinea pigs have precocial offspring. This is a really long video, so we're going to skip ahead here, but this is a female guinea pig giving birth, and I'm going to skip ahead here to a point where one of her offspring is already born. So this is a newborn, and you can really contrast this with the very altricial other rodent that we saw a few minutes ago. And here comes the second one, just sort of pops out there. They're born fully furred. Their sensory systems are functional, so they can hear, they can see, and they can locomote, as you can see with this, the one that was born just a few minutes previously. Alrighty. So the next section we're going to move to covers basic anatomy and physiology. We're first going to cover females, and then we'll go over male structures. A lot of this will be really familiar to you if you've had any reproductive anatomy instruction in your past in high school, or taken an anatomy and physiology class. So a lot of the words will be familiar, but what you may not be familiar with is that there's a lot of variability in mammals. So while they may have the same parts, they have them organized in slightly different ways depending on the species. So first we're going to look at eutherian mammals, since they're more like us and probably more familiar, and then we'll contrast that with monotremes and marsupials. So the basic structures, there are two ovaries that produce the gametes. They're called ova, plural, the singular is ovum. Once they're released from the oviducts, or released from the ovary, they move through the oviducts or fallopian tubes to the uterus. They're usually fertilized in the oviducts or fallopian tubes. The uterus is where they implant for eutherian mammals. The cervix is a structure that closes off the uterus from the outside world, and then the vagina is the connection between the internal reproductive tract and the rest of the world. So we'll look here at a picture really quick. So if we look at the simplex version, this is what we have probably most familiar. The ovaries are here, the oviducts are here. This is the uterus. The cervix is denoted by this thickened line that's cross-sectional, so it's really just a thick tissue that closes off the uterus, and then we have the vagina at the bottom. All right, so you'll notice with the numbers that different kinds of mammals can have different numbers of these parts. So every mammal has 2 ovaries, 2 oviducts, but they can have 1 or 2 uteri and 1 or 2 cervices. We're going to look really quickly now at monotremes and marsupials, at some of the differences between the two. So monotremes don't have internal development of offspring. Monotremes have 2 ovaries, just like all other mammals, and 2 oviducts, but then the reproductive tract starts to get a little different. The uterus has 2 partitions to it, but there is no cervix. There's no closing off the uterus from the rest of the world. And then instead of a vagina like other mammals have, they have one tract that contains the outputs of the urinary tract, the digestive tract, and the reproductive tract. So it all comes together, and there's a single opening called a cloaca. And that's actually where monotreme gets its name, mono, one, treme meaning hole. So there's one hole for all these products to come out. If we look at marsupials, they are also very different than eutherian mammals. So they have, again, 2 ovaries, 2 oviducts. The uterus has 2 partitions to it. But then and then there's no real cervix, but the vagina splits into two, so they're called lateral vaginas, these two passageways. And they serve as the passageway for sperm only. So when the female mates, the sperm come into the reproductive tract and go up one of these two pathways, and then fertilization will occur in the oviducts here. The infant will develop in the uterus, and when it's time for it to be born, it travels out through a different pathway. There's a temporary structure that forms that's called the medial vagina. And so when the infant exits the reproductive tract, it'll travel through this medial vagina to the outside. The contents of the urinary system, the bladder, also open into this tract. So this section at the end here is called the urogenital sinus, and that's also true of some placental mammals, but it's true of all marsupials. Nobody knows why marsupials have this odd structure, and there's an additional complication that the urethras coming from, or ureters coming from the kidneys to the bladder, also pass through this hole where the medial vaginas or the lateral vaginas are. So it's a very unusual, complex structure that's very different than what we see in other species. Alrighty. So I showed you the picture earlier, but I kind of glanced over the variability in the different types of reproductive systems. Primates, including humans, have this simplex system, which has a single uterus, a single cervix, and a single vagina. And there are other species that also have this kind of setup, including things like anteaters and sloths, and lots of primate species. But there are three other versions of the eutherian reproductive system. So let's take a look at those. So in the duplex system, duplex meaning two, everything is basically doubled. So in addition to having two ovaries and two fallopian tubes, there are two completely separate uteri and two completely separate cervices. So each cervix closes off its uterus, and they all empty into a single vagina. Then there's a system called bipartite, which has two uteri, but only one cervix, and the cervix is like a sort of Y-shaped connector that you might find in a plumbing system. And when it closes off these two separate uteri, but it has a single opening into the vagina when it's time for either sperm to go in or the infants to come out. And then we have the bicornuate system, which has a single uterus that is kind of Y-shaped. I like to think of it as being like a Mickey Mouse hat. You know, it's got a body here and two horns in the uterus. And then it has one cervix that empties into the vagina. So this variability in structures in the reproductive tract is associated with the number of offspring that are born. So you can see here the duplex system is what we find in species that have lots and lots of infants. The bipartite system in species that have a medium number of offspring. Bicornuate uteri are found, or the bicornuate system is found in species that have usually more than one, sometimes one offspring, but 2, 3, 4 offspring, like some insectivores and ungulates like cows and sheep, and bats, and some primate species. So it's clearly associated with numbers of offspring from more to less. And it has to do with surface area. If you look at the structure of the system, the placenta engages in gas exchange with the surface of the mother's uterus. And so a single offspring has the whole surface of the uterus to be in contact with, and so gas exchange is very easy. But when you have multiple offspring, if you were to try to stack them up in here, if you had, say, 20 offspring, some of them would be on the outside and some of them would be on the inside, and the ones on the inside wouldn't have contact with the uterine wall. I like to analogize this with gumballs in a gumball machine. The ones on the inside would not be able to grow and develop. So instead, they stack in these uterine horns, almost like peas in a pod, one after another, and that provides room for gas exchange and nutrient exchange.